Does the property of being a chair actually exist? No, not if you ask me, but I mean, of course, chairs exist since I'm sitting in a variant of one. But let me elaborate. We humans are very creative when it comes to objects and their properties. For instance, take these properties. Being owned by X, being taller than X, being a unicorn, being beautiful. My question is, does any of these properties or predicates denote anything real? If we ask Plato, he would simply say that all of these things exist in their ideal state within the world of forms, and if an object possesses one of these properties, it simply takes part of this or that universal. And for Plato, a universal exists even if there is no instantiation of it within our world. Like the unicorn, for example. The universal of unicorns still exists within the world of forms. I know, it's a little bit weird. And obviously, the universal of chairs would also exist within the world of forms. What would that universal look like? Well, I guess 4 legs and a whatever it's called. But if one would make the claim that any sort of predicate denotes an actual property, that is sometimes referred to as abundant properties. But as you can imagine, the Platonist view has its problems. So the thing is, does the property of being a chair actually exist in any real sense? For instance, take this property, lecturing about natural properties in a red armchair. This is a property that my body possesses at the moment. But would we really say that this property exists in any real sense? Just because someone has invented a word, does that mean that the property it denotes exists? No, I would say, since there are some properties that are more fundamental than this one, let's say. Some properties carve nature at its joints, to use a fancy expression. For instance, the property of having a negative charge, which is possessed by all electrons, seems to be a more fundamental property than, say, if an object has the property of being a swan. So, having a negative charge is what can be considered a natural property. These natural properties is also sometimes referred to as sparse properties. And the thing is that we need a theory that can distinguish between these two different levels of properties, sparse from abundant properties. And if we ask the philosopher David Armstrong, the way we distinguish them is through universals. Note, not Platonic universals, more like Aristotelian universals. But more about that in another episode. The sparse properties are universals, according to David Armstrong. They are the very building blocks of reality itself. And the thing with universals is that they are the same property in each of their instantiation. Whenever we have an electron, it has the sparse property of having a negative charge. And this negative charge will always behave in exactly the same manner, for it is the same property in each of its instantiation. It is a universal. While the property of being a swan is not exactly the same in each of its instantiation, right? Because here you have a black swan, and here is a white swan. They don't either look or behave exactly the same. Thus, the property of being a swan is not a universal, and thus it's not a real property. And the way we figure out if something is a sparse or an abundant property is through empirical research. We should simply ask our fellow physicists which properties that actually exist. So in answering the question from the beginning, does the property of being a chair actually exist? Well, as a sparse property, certainly not. But there's an obvious problem here, right? Because we still have the need to refer to things that are not universals. It would be really weird and impractical if we would only refer to sparse properties. Hey there, could you please fetch me that pile of atoms? Which one? So Armstrong suggests that there is a supervenience relation between these two different levels of properties. So through this, the property of being a chair sort of exists in a reductive manner. But let's talk a little bit about David Lewis. He is an odd type of nominalist. He proposes that we should think of a property as being the set of all its instances. And when he says all, he means all, including all the instances in possible worlds. So the property of being a unicorn is the set of all unicorns within possible worlds. But why should we include possible worlds here? Isn't it just sufficient to say that the property of being a chair is the set of all chairs within our world? But unfortunately, that way of construing properties is insufficient because of the problem of coextensives. But that is an issue for another episode. So Lewis doesn't believe in universals. But how does he succeed in distinguishing unnatural from natural, abundant from sparse properties? Well, one way to do it is a version of nominalism that treats resemblances as primitives. Here he writes, "Let us say that an adequate theory of properties is one that recognizes an objective difference between natural and unnatural properties, preferably a difference that admits of degree. A combined theory of properties and universals is one sort of adequate theory of properties, but not the only sort. A nominalistic theory of properties could achieve adequacy by other means. Instead of employing universals, it could draw a primitive distinction among particulars. Most simply, a nominalist could take it as a primitive fact that some classes of things are perfectly natural properties. Others are less than perfectly natural to various degrees, and most are not at all natural. Such a nominalist takes natural as a primitive predicate, and offers no analysis of what he means in predicating it of classes. His intention is to select the very same classes as natural properties that the user of universals would select, but he regards the universals as idle machinery, fictitiously superimposed on the primitive, objective difference between the natural properties and the others. Through this, some properties can be considered as more natural than others, for they bear more closely resemblance to each other than other properties. For instance, the resemblance between two donkeys is farther than the resemblance between two electrons. What do you guys think? Is it reasonable to take the notion of resemblance as primitive and not even try to explain it? But through this move, Lewis doesn't have to postulate universals, but he's still more than happy to postulate every possible world. But oh well. My plan for the next episode will be on the nature of modality, and you can check out that video